Do you often get requests to call a particular player's name? I know a lot of people have favorite calls, whether it's you or the legendary Harry Callis. What do you get requested the most from fans to call?
Their names. When I'm at a different place, number one, PA announcers, unlike radio and television play-by-play men, are the PA announcers are somewhat anonymous because you don't necessarily recognize the face of a PA announcer, and you may not even recognize the voice because our voice is usually heard, over an amplification system in a ballpark or stadium or arena. And I couldn't tell you how many times that I'm introduced to someone in a social setting, and they'll say, well, this is Dan Baker, the Phillies and Eagles PA announcer. And I'll see somebody look at me quizzically as if to say, well, I don't recognize you, and I don't even recognize the sound of your voice. And so I'll usually announce a name or two. Now batting for the Phillies, number 19, left fielder Greg Luzinski. And they'll go, oh, yeah, you're him. And, because I usually talk slowly and more deliberately when I'm talking over the PA system to make sure that, you can understand me. Because when we're talking face-to-face, even if all of the words aren't announced clearly, you can pretty much understand what they are by looking at the person's facial expression, reading their lips, in conjunction with whatever sound you hear. But when you don't get a chance to see the person and you're relying on sound only, it's all the more important to enunciate every syllable and make sure that you can be understood.
Right. What are some of the Phillies moments that you've been on hand for that more or less stand out to you as the most memorable during your career?
Well, of course, winning the two World Series are the two most exciting times, 1980 and 2008. The other three times that the Phillies have made World Series appearances, and for which I had the privilege to announce those games, will probably be second. And of course, the 3 years in which the Phillies went to a World Series that I announced, but they didn't win it, would be 1983, 1993, and 2009. And I already mentioned that winning the World Series in 1980 and 2008. So I have had, the privilege to announce 5 Phillies World Series and 2 Major League Baseball All-Star games, 1976 and 1996. And in addition to that, I've announced 3 NFC Championship games, when the Philadelphia Eagles hosted them, 2002, 2003, and 2004. So those would be, my PA announcing highlights. I've done 6 Army-Navy games, which are real classics. Along the way, I had a chance to introduce President Bush at a couple of the Army-Navy games, and at the 1976 Major League Baseball All-Star game, I had a chance at that time to introduce then President of the United States, Gerald R. Ford. So those certainly were highlights.
Something a lot of people don't know about you is how your family more or less began at the venues that you work at. And just talk about the family affair that has developed from working for the Phillies and for the Eagles.
Well, I met my wife Kathy at the Phillies, Kathy with a C. Kathy comes from she was a cheerleader herself in high school. She went to Penn State. And she's a big fan. She worked full-time at the Phillies in marketing and sales, and we met the year that I started working there in 1972. We were engaged in 1973 and married in 1974. And then both of our children, we have 2 children, Darren, who was born in 1980, and what a great year that was for the Bakers. The Phillies won their first ever World Series, and our son, Darren, was born. And then we had one other child, and her name is Courtney, and Courtney Baker was born in 1983. And another year that was great for the Phillies because they won the World Series, even though they lost to the Orioles in the World Series that year. So, in fact, in the background, Courtney's calling me on my cell phone, so I will leave that go for a moment, and I'll return her call when our interview's finished.
Well, thank you.
But Courtney is both my son and daughter worked many summers for the Phillies. My son worked as a videographer. My daughter worked as a babysitter. And the Phillies provide a service, Jay, whereby they hire, maybe 8 to 10 young women, usually college age, a year, and they provide a service whereby the Phillies players' wives can bring their children to the games and drop off the children in the Phillies family lounge, and these young women will watch the kids while the mothers go sit in the seats and watch their husbands play baseball. My son and daughter are big Philadelphia sports fans.
That's great. Dan, I wanted to know, have you ever had an instance where you were unsure of how to pronounce a player or an individual's name, or do you do your homework well ahead of time and you haven't had that as an issue?
Jay, once again, a good question. It usually doesn't happen at the last minute because what I try to do, I get to a sporting event a couple of hours before the game begins, and I go over the rosters for both teams just to check and see if there's any names with which I'm unfamiliar. So it's not uncommon, Jay, for me to run into a name that does present a challenge, but I will just circle the names that I'm unsure of, and then I'll go ask the visiting PR guy, or in some cases the visiting radio or television guy. Sometimes I'll even ask a manager or coach or the player himself if I'm not sure. But no, it's very important. To me, one of the cardinal rules of a PA announcer is you must know how to say everybody's name correctly. So you have to do your homework in advance. You don't want to let that go to the last minute and